Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second video of So You Want to Conduct an Oral History. For those of you who don't remember, maybe it took a little bit of a break between video 1 and video 2, my name is Gene Hardy, and I am an assistant professor at Michigan State University. I am also your guide for this video series. Recall that the goal of this series is to familiarize you with oral histories and prepare you to conduct them yourself. As a reminder, there are 4 videos in this series, including video 1, What is Oral History? Video 2, Components of an Oral History Interview, which is this one. Video 3, Preparing for an Oral History Interview. And video 4, Conducting an Oral History Interview. If you are using the Benzonia Public Library's equipment available for checkout, there is also a complimentary video by photographer and videographer Jeff Smith on our YouTube channel. That video will walk you through how to use the equipment to record oral histories. To quickly recap the last video, video 1 explained that oral history is a field of study and a method of gathering, preserving, and interpreting voices and memories of people, communities, and participants in past events. We talked about how oral histories are traditionally passed down person to person and nowadays are done through interviews and recorded so they can be preserved. We also learned that oral histories are important because they help us document unwritten histories. But coming back to this video, we are going to be learning about what makes up an oral history interview. So I have 2 main objectives for you to learn from this video. First, you will use your own experiences to understand the overall purpose of an interview. Second, you will learn about the various components of an oral history interview and why they are important. So, what is an interview? At its very basic, an interview is a structured conversation where someone asks questions and someone else answers them. Pretty straightforward, right? Whether we know it or not, interviews appear in many parts of our lives. For example, the vast majority of us 16 or older have taken part in a job interview at some point in our lives. Interviews are also very common in media and journalism. For example, in sports journalism, athletes will often be interviewed when they're done on the court, if in basketball, for example. And lastly, this one is less common, but some of you might have also been interviewed if you've ever gone to see a psychiatrist or taken part in any kind of academic research. At the basis of all of these is one common component. That is, interviews are largely about garnering information from someone. Interviews generally have similar components. 2 people are usually involved, the interviewer, aka the person doing the interviewing, and the interviewee, the person being interviewed. The interview itself, I like to think of, has 4 components. First, an introduction and framing, where the interviewer describes the purpose of the interview. Second, a question portion, where the interviewer asks questions of the interviewee to elicit information about that person. Third, follow-up questions. These are questions that were not planned for, but come up in the process of information gathering. And lastly, there's closure, where the interviewer wraps up the interview and in some cases explains what's going to happen next. Let me use the example of a job interview to explain these components in more detail. First up, we have the introduction and framing, or the purpose. In a typical job interview, the interviewee and interviewer are going to introduce themselves, and the interviewer is likely going to explain a bit about the job expectations and what they're going to ask in the interview. Second are the questions, and this has to do with eliciting information, data, history, etc. In a job interview, the interview is likely to ask a series of questions about job history, how the interviewee works under pressure, the various skills they have that are relevant to the job, etc. This is the information gathering component. Next are follow-up questions. Sometimes in a job interview, the interviewer asks follow-up questions about something the interviewee says. Maybe the person being interviewed had a really unique job or a very unique skill set, and the interviewee isn't familiar with it and they want to learn more about it. And lastly, the closure. Finally, the job interview concludes, the interviewer explains what the next steps are and tells the interviewer what the expected hiring timeline will be. So what do interviews allow that other forms of information collection do not? We know that there are many ways to gather information about people. We can interview people like we're talking about here. We can have people take surveys. We can also look at people's behavior to observe patterns and activities that shed light on their day-to-day life. I like to think that interviews are important for three primary reasons, and that also these reasons make them different than other forms of information gathering. First, interviews allow people to share information about themselves in their own words. Second, interviews allow for depth and breadth of information. In other words, when you interview someone, you can learn both a lot of information about a specific part of their experience, the depth, as well as a lot of information about little bits of their life, the breadth. Third, interviews are great because they can be personalized and tailored to the individual. This means that no two interviews have to be the same. So now we've spent some time talking about what interviews are, but how does an oral history interview differ from other types of interviews? As a reminder, I'd like to return to our definition of oral history, and that oral history is a method of gathering, preserving, and interpreting the voices and memories of people, communities, and participants in past events. So while oral histories are a form of an interview in that you want to gather information, their purpose is to gather and preserve a specific person or group of people's history. Now I want to explain what an oral history interview looks like using the same components that we talked about earlier, so you can start thinking about what an oral history might look like for you. So first, there is the introduction and framing. Second, and this wasn't talked about in a normal interview, but is important for us, and that's a warm-up. Third will be prepared questions. Fourth will be follow-up questions. And finally, closure. So let's go through these step by step. The first step is introduction and framing. The introduction is where you're going to introduce yourself and the goal of conducting the oral history. You should go over what the interview will be about, and if you have any paperwork for them to sign, something that you'll learn more about in video 3, you should have them sign the paperwork. Next up is warm-up questions. Warm-up questions are essential for conducting oral histories. Most people don't have experience talking about themselves or their history, so it's helpful to ask people warm-up questions to get them comfortable talking. This could be something as simple as where they live, what their hobbies are, or maybe even who their favorite Ninja Turtle is. Third are the prepared questions. You're going to move into your prepared questions after you've had some opportunity to warm up your interviewee. The prepared questions are the ones that you wrote down to ask beforehand. We'll also talk more about what it looks like to prepare questions in video 3. During your prepared questions, you should be listening intently, reflecting on the answers you are receiving as well as their quality, and noting opportunities for follow-up questions that ask for further explanation and potentially depth of answers. Follow-up questions can happen at any point in the interview, and the goal is to get better, maybe deeper information from the interviewee. For example, you might have asked where someone grew up and what it was like growing up there. Their response to your question could have been lackluster. For example, I grew up in Traverse City, Michigan, and it was a typical Midwestern town. Likely, you were hoping for a little bit more information about what it was like growing up there. So you could ask potentially follow-up questions such as, what were your favorite things about growing up in Traverse City? This would hopefully allow you to elicit deeper and more interesting information and history from someone's experience. Finally, you need to close the interview. If you've talked about sad topics, it might be useful to make sure you close the interview on a positive note by returning to potentially positive things that you want to ask follow-up questions about. You should also ask the person you're interviewing if they have any questions for you. While what I've talked about in this video is a bit formulaic or prescriptive, you can get creative and you can make oral history interviews your own. This is just one of many ways. So to recap what we've covered in this video, first, we learned what an interview is and used the example of a job interview to explain how they work. Second, we learned about the various components of an oral history interview and how it makes it different from other types of interview. In the next video, we are going to be talking about preparing for an oral history interview. While it is not necessary to have someone in mind who you want to conduct an oral history with, the third video will be more helpful if you do have someone in mind when you're learning about how to prepare for an oral history interview. Some questions to think about before you watch the next video. I would encourage you to spend some time answering the following 2 questions in detail before you start it. First, what kind of people do you want to interview? In other words, what kind of stories do you want to tell? Second, what do you want to learn from conducting the oral history? Why would an oral history with the person you're thinking about be important to you? What do you think that others will learn? As always, if you're interested in additional resources about oral histories, check out the Oral History Association's website, www.oralhistory.org. They have lots of resources on conducting oral histories, including best principles and practices, which parts of the series are based on. There's also the Michigan Oral History Association, which is located at www.michiganoha.org. And of course, while you're here and maybe you want to learn a little bit more about other oral histories and see some for yourself, I would highly recommend checking out the Benzonia Public Library's own Remembering Benzie project that's located on the library's YouTube page. There, you'll be able to see oral histories that were conducted by high school students in 2019 and 2020. This marks the end of video 2. I look forward to seeing you in video 3. Thank you.